The air tasted like copper and fear. Sarah's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold onto the fence post, her knuckles white against the splintered wood that was digging into her palms. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of orange and red that looked too beautiful for a moment this terrifying. She could hear them getting closer. The voices of men who had decided that a woman alone on a farm was easy prey, men who thought that being outnumbered meant being powerless. Her breath came in short gasps that burned her throat, and she could feel the sweat running down her spine despite the evening chill that was starting to settle over the valley. 3 hours. That was how long she had been running, hiding, trying to find a way to escape men who knew this land almost as well as she did. The farm that had been her sanctuary, the place where she had rebuilt her life after losing everything, had become a trap. And the worst part, the part that made her chest tight with a pain that had nothing to do with exhaustion, was knowing that there was no one coming to help. No neighbors close enough to hear her screams, no phone signal in this remote corner of the countryside. Just her, the approaching darkness, and 3 men who had made it clear what they intended to do. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, trying to remember her father's face, trying to hold on to the memory of his voice, telling her she was stronger than she knew. But the memory felt distant and fragile, like something that could shatter if she held it too tightly. When she opened her eyes again, she saw movement through the trees. They had found her trail. She could hear one of them laughing, a sound that made her stomach turn, a laugh that said he was enjoying the hunt. Her legs were screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The cliff was behind her, the forest thick with brambles to her left, and the men were coming from her right. She was trapped in a space no bigger than her father's old barn, with options that were narrowing with every second that passed. That was when she heard the sound, different from the voices of the men hunting her, deeper, calmer. The sound of a single horse moving through the underbrush with a confidence that spoke of someone who belonged to this wild place. Sarah turned her head, hope and fear warring in her chest, because hope had disappointed her before, because trusting the wrong person now could be worse than facing what she already knew was coming. And then she saw him, a man on horseback, emerging from the shadows between the trees, tall and broad-shouldered in a way that made him look like he had grown from the land itself. His face was partially hidden by the brim of his hat, but even in the fading light, she could see his eyes, eyes that found hers across the distance and held them with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. He did not ask what was wrong, did not waste time with questions that did not matter. He simply looked at her, then looked in the direction of the approaching voices, and something in his expression changed. Something that went from calm to dangerous in the space of a heartbeat. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest when his gaze returned to her face. It was not pity she saw there. It was not the hesitation of someone trying to decide if getting involved was worth the trouble. It was a decision already made, a certainty that needed no words, a promise written in the set of his jaw and the way he moved his horse between her and the approaching danger. One of the men burst through the trees, saw the stranger on horseback, and stopped. His smile faltered when he saw the expression on the newcomer's face. The other 2 emerged behind him, and Sarah watched their confidence waver as they realized they were no longer dealing with a woman alone. The stranger spoke then, and his voice carried across the clearing with a quiet authority that made the hair on Sarah's arms stand up. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who had made a choice and would not be moved from it. And in that moment, with the sun disappearing behind the mountains and 3 dangerous men facing one, Sarah understood that everything was about to change. That this moment, this meeting, this collision of her desperation and his intervention would alter the course of her life in ways she could not yet imagine. She did not know his name, did not know where he had come from, or why he had appeared at the exact moment when hope had seemed impossible. But she knew with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than logic, that she was looking at the man who would redefine what safety meant, what protection looked like, what it felt like to not be alone anymore. And it was in that instant that she realized nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Main script. There are places in the Montana valleys where even the bravest ranchers avoid stepping. James knew this, but when his cattle disappeared into the flooded lowlands, he had no choice but to break the very rules he had learned from his grandfather. What James did not expect was to discover he was not alone in those wild lands, much less that his life would change forever because of 3 hungry mountain lions and a woman who should not exist. Because when you are about to die in the middle of nowhere and someone appears from nowhere to save you, the words that person says afterward can change everything. And the words that Elena said to James that afternoon in the Montana wilderness would mark the beginning of a story he had never imagined possible. The tracks disappeared into the dark mud, but James kept following even when the sun began to set. 3 hours searching for the cattle, 3 hours moving farther and farther from safe lands, entering the territory his grandfather had always told him to avoid. It was when the silence arrived that James realized his mistake. In the Montana wilderness, silence meant only one thing: predator nearby. And when the first growl echoed behind him, low and threatening, he understood he had broken the most important rule of all. When he turned around, he saw 3 pairs of golden eyes shining in the vegetation. Mountain lions, adults, hungry, and moving in a circle around him like experienced hunters. James felt the cold sweat run down his back when he realized there was no tall tree nearby, no obvious escape route, just him, the mountain lions, and the certainty that he had made a fatal mistake. That was when she appeared. "Now you are my man, James from the Clear Creek Ranch." Her voice echoed in the hot air like a declaration that admitted no questioning, carrying a primitive certainty that made his heart race for reasons he could not understand. She had not asked his name, had not hesitated before speaking the name of the property he had inherited from his grandfather. She knew who he was, as if she had known him for years. James stood still, watching her walk away with the mountain lions at her side, and felt something strange happen inside his chest. It was not fear, although it should have been. It was not relief at being alive, although it should have been that too. It was a warm and heavy sensation, as if something had moved inside him and found a new place to settle. The way she had said those words, with a natural possession that seemed to come from a very ancient place, awakened something in James that he did not know existed. He gathered the cattle and began the journey back, but his hands were shaking on the reins, and his mind could not move away from her image. The way she moved, as if every muscle in her body knew the secrets of that wild territory. The scent he had felt when she passed close to him, a mixture of wet earth, wild herbs, and something more that made his stomach contract in a way he could not explain. During the entire journey back, James tried to convince himself that he had imagined everything, that exhaustion, fear, and the strong sun had created a hallucination. But when he arrived at the gate of his property and looked back, she was there, standing on top of a small rise, watching him with the same intensity with which she had looked in the wilderness. The distance was too great to see her eyes, but he felt the weight of that gaze, as if she were inches away. That night, James could not sleep. He sat on the porch of the wooden house his grandfather had built, looking toward the Montana wilderness and thinking about her words. "My man," as if he had just been marked by something greater than himself, as if a decision had been made without his participation in the process. And the most disturbing part was that deep down, a part of him wanted to discover what that meant. When the first ray of sun cut the horizon, James saw a small fire lighting up in the direction where she had disappeared. A fire that should not exist because there were no buildings in that area of the wilderness. At least there were none the last time he checked, but something told him that perhaps he had never really known his own land. James took 3 days to gather enough courage to return to the wilderness. 3 days trying to convince himself that he was not interested in the mysterious woman, just concerned about the safety of his property. After all, someone was living on his land without permission, and he had the right to investigate. At least that was what he repeated to himself as he rode toward the area where he had seen the fire. What he found made him question everything he knew about that region. There were clear signs of permanent occupation. A small clearing opened between the trees, a rustic wooden cabin built with fitted logs and a thatched roof, remains of old fires forming a perfect circle of blackened stones. But the most impressive were the plants. Medicinal herbs grew organized in small beds, as if someone had been cultivating them for years. There were also simple traps for small animals, made with vines and twigs, and marks on the trees that seemed to indicate directions or warnings. James dismounted and walked through the clearing, trying to understand how he had not noticed this occupation before. The area was located on a natural elevation, partially hidden by a rock formation that made it almost invisible from a distance. Whoever had chosen that location knew the terrain better than he did, and this realization disturbed him deeply. The cabin showed signs of constant maintenance, as if it had been inhabited for decades. It was when he found the footprints that his breathing became heavier. Human footprints, small and barefoot, intertwined with mountain lion tracks in an intimacy that should be impossible. The marks followed together for meters, as if woman and felines walked side by side regularly. James crouched down to examine the footprints more closely and smelled the scent before seeing her. Wet earth, wild herbs, and that indefinable aroma he had noticed 3 days before. When he raised his eyes, she was leaning against the cabin's doorframe, watching him with an expression that mixed amusement and something deeper. She wore the same torn dress, but this time James could see details he had missed in the first encounter. The way the fabric molded to her body, revealing curves that made his mouth dry. The sun marks on her brown skin, as if she lived permanently outdoors. The small hands, but visibly strong, as if they were accustomed to 20 years of hard work and survival. "You took longer than I expected," she said, and her voice carried a familiarity that made James's stomach contract. She spoke as if he had scheduled a meeting, as if his arrival there was inevitable. And when she began to walk toward him, with those silent and feline steps, James realized that perhaps it really was, that perhaps, from the moment she declared he was her man, this conversation had already been destined to happen. At 34 years old, she carried a maturity that came from someone who had learned to survive alone from a very young age. James tried to find words to ask who she was, how she had gotten there, why she knew his name. But when she stopped a few steps from him, so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin, all rational questions disappeared from his mind. What remained was an acute awareness of how she smelled, how her dark eyes seemed to see through him, how her presence made the air around seem denser and charged. "My name is Elena," she said, as if she had read his thoughts, "and I have always lived here." James shook his head, confused. This was impossible. He knew every inch of his property. He had grown up on this land, explored every trail since childhood. How could a woman be living there without him knowing? She smiled at seeing his expression, a smile that revealed white and perfect teeth, but that carried a hint of deep melancholy. "Your family never ventured very far during the rainy season," Elena continued, approaching even closer. "It was always a family of dry land, not of wilderness. Your grandfather knew I was here, but respected my need to stay isolated." James felt the impact of those words. His grandfather had died 5 years ago and had never mentioned any woman living in the flooded lands. Why would he keep such a secret? James felt the impulse to step back when she extended her hand and touched his chest, right where the shirt was open. The touch was light, almost irreverent, but sent a wave of heat through his body that made him tremble visibly. "My mother brought me here when I was 13, she murmured, and James realized his breathing was uneven. She was running from a violent man who hurt her every day. She thought that here we would be safe. The pain in her voice made something contract in James's chest. There was a much darker story behind those eyes than he had imagined. "And your mother?" he asked softly, feeling he was touching something very delicate. Elena lowered her eyes for a moment, and when she raised them again, James saw an ancient sadness that made him want to hug her immediately. "He found us," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of years of pain. "He took her away by force." 3 days later, they found her body in the woods. James felt anger growing in his chest, an anger directed at a man he did not even know, but who had destroyed an innocent child's life. "Since then I have lived alone here," Eleanor continued, removing her hand from his chest, but staying close enough for him to feel her breath. "The mountain lions found me in the first month. Instead of attacking me, they protected me, as if they understood I was also a lost orphan." Before James could fully process the magnitude of that revelation, a distant sound echoed through the Montana wilderness, a sound that froze his blood and made Elena stiffen instantly. It was the sound of horses galloping and male voices shouting brutal orders. "You need to leave," Elena said, and all the softness in her voice transformed into mortal urgency. "Now, James." James saw something in her eyes that was not just fear. It was the experience of someone who knew real danger and knew how to recognize it by sounds. She grabbed his arm and started pulling him in the opposite direction from the horses, but James resisted, too confused to move. "Who are they?" he asked, but she shook her head impatiently. "They are hunters," she said, and the word came out like a curse from her mouth. "William and his men kill the mountain lions to sell the pelts, and I have been interfering with them for years. If they find you here with me, they will invent a story that can destroy your life." Elena pushed James harder, and he realized that beneath the urgency there was something like real desperation. "Go through the stream. The footprints will disappear in the water. Go back to your house and pretend you were never here." The voices were getting closer, and James could distinguish some brutal words. They were looking for Elena, shouting obscenities about what they would do when they found her. The tone of the voices made James's blood freeze. It was the tone of men accustomed to solving problems with violence. "But I am not going to leave you alone," James said firmly, refusing to move. "Why do they want to hurt you? What did you do to them?" Eleanor stopped trying to drag him and looked directly into his eyes. At that moment, James saw something in her expression that made his stomach contract. It was not just determination. It was the mark of someone who had spent years fighting a silent and dangerous war. "I destroy their traps every week," she said, and her voice became firmer. "I scare the animals when they approach. I sabotage the camps when they sleep. The mountain lions have been my friends for 20 years, James. They are all I have left of the family I lost. I will not let any man kill them for money." The revelation hit James like a powerful force. Elena was not just living isolated in the Montana wilderness. She was waging a war to protect the animals that had protected her when she lost everything. James felt a deep admiration growing in his chest, a need to protect this woman who had dedicated her life to protecting defenseless creatures. "They will not hurt you," he said, and the determination in his own voice surprised him. Elena opened her eyes, surprised by the intensity of his declaration. James took her hands in his, feeling how they were small but incredibly calloused from hard work. "You said I am your man, so let me act like one." The sound of horses was getting closer and closer, and James could hear the voices clearly now. There were 3 men, and they were dividing the territory among themselves to search more efficiently. One of them shouted that he had found fresh footprints near the stream, footprints that were probably James's. Before Eleanor could respond, a male and cruel voice echoed much closer than they expected. "We know you are there, Eleanor. It is time to settle this once and for all." James felt Eleanor tremble against him when the voice echoed through the clearing. It was a voice that carried cruelty and familiarity, as if it had known Elena for a long time. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then moved away from James with an expression that had become completely different. The wild and confident woman had disappeared, replaced by someone who seemed to be preparing for a battle that had already lasted years. "Go," she whispered to James one last time, but he shook his head and moved behind a rock formation where he could observe without being seen. He was not going to let her face this alone, regardless of who those men were or what they wanted. Elena took a deep breath again, straightened her shoulders like a soldier preparing for war, and walked in the direction of the voice. 3 men emerged from the vegetation, mounted on sweaty and nervous horses. The speaker, a man of about 52 years old with scars on his face and clothes dirty with mud and dried blood, dismounted and walked toward Elena with threatening steps. The other 2 remained mounted, flanking him like soldiers. James noticed that all carried large machetes and ropes, and there was something in their eyes that made him feel a chill down his spine. 5 years, Elena. 5 years interfering with our work." The man stopped a few meters from her, and James could see his face clearly. It was cruel in a way that came from years of practicing violence, with small, hard eyes that seemed accustomed to making others suffer. "You cost us a lot of money with your games of animal protector." Elena kept her chin up, but James noticed how her fists were clenched. "They are not games, William. You are killing the mountain lions that have protected this region for generations. I will not let you turn the wilderness into a cemetery just to fill your pockets." Her words revealed years of struggle, a silent war between a woman alone and men willing to destroy everything for profit. The man called William laughed, but it was a humorless laugh that made James's stomach contract. "You were always too stubborn for your own good, girl. But today, this ends. We will no longer have our traps destroyed, our camp sabotaged, our animals scared away by a crazy woman who talks to mountain lions." James felt anger growing inside him when he heard the man's disrespectful tone, the way he spoke about Elena as if she were a wild animal that needed to be tamed. Elena took a step back, and James saw her hands trembling slightly for the first time. "I will never stop protecting the mountain lions. You can threaten me all you want, but I will not let you destroy what is left of the wild nature." William made a signal to the other 2 men, who began to dismount with determined and dangerous expressions. "We did not come here to negotiate, Elena. We came to solve a problem, once and for all." James could not stay hidden when he saw the 2 men approaching Elena with machetes in hand. The anger he felt was physical, a hot sensation that rose from his stomach to his throat and made him come out from behind the rocks without thinking about the consequences. "Stop!" he shouted, and his voice echoed through the clearing with an authority he did not know he possessed. The 3 men turned immediately, and James could see the surprise on their faces when they recognized him. William narrowed his eyes, clearly trying to assess the situation. "James from Clear Creek Ranch," he said slowly, spitting on the ground afterward. "I did not know you had business with troublemakers." James walked until he was beside Elena, feeling the tension in the air intensify with each step. "This is my land, William, and you are threatening a woman on my property with weapons. I suggest you mount your horses and leave before I call the authorities." Elena looked at James with a mixture of gratitude and concern. She knew he was taking a risk for her, and James realized that this decision was changing something fundamental between them. It was no longer about attraction or curiosity. It was about choosing to protect someone who mattered to him, regardless of the consequences. William took a step toward James, clearly irritated by the interference. "This is none of your business, boy. This woman has been interfering with our work for years, destroying our equipment, scaring away the animals. She owes us a lot of money." James felt his blood boil with those words. "Your work is illegal, William. Hunting mountain lions is a federal crime, and intimidation with weapons is too." James moved slightly in front of Elena, a protective position that did not go unnoticed by any of the men present. "Besides," he continued with a calmness that surprised even himself, "you are invading private property armed and threatening a person under my protection. I can report this to the town authorities as attempted assault and illegal hunting." The mention of authorities made William's 2 companions exchange nervous glances. They clearly did not expect to find resistance, much less from someone with property and influence in the region. William realized he was losing control of the situation, and his expression became more dangerous. "You do not know what you are getting into, James. This woman is disturbed, living alone in the wilderness for 20 years, talking to wild animals. She is not normal." James felt Eleanor move slightly behind him, and when he looked quickly over his shoulder, he saw she had straightened completely. The fear had disappeared from her eyes, replaced by fierce determination. It was as if his presence beside her had returned all her strength. "Elena is more normal than any man who kills defenseless animals for money," James responded firmly. "And braver than 3 armed men who need to unite to intimidate a woman alone." William remained silent for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. James maintained his firm posture, and Elena moved until she was completely beside him, showing they had chosen to stand united against any threat. The message was clear. She was no longer alone, and any attempt to hurt her would have to go through James first. "This is not over," William said finally, but his voice had lost its previous authority. "We know where you live, James, and we know this crazy woman will keep interfering with our work." James took a step forward, and his response came loaded with a threatening calmness that made the 3 men step back. "Then maybe it is time for you to look for another type of work. And if you come back to threaten Elena or hunt illegally in this region, I will make sure the federal authorities know exactly who you are and where to find you." William's 2 companions were already mounting their horses, clearly uncomfortable with the situation and the mention of federal authorities. William followed reluctantly, but before leaving he turned one last time with an expression of pure hatred. "You chose the wrong side, James. This woman is not worth the trouble she will bring to your life." James smiled, and for the first time since the beginning of the confrontation, his expression softened completely. "She is worth any trouble, and worth being protected by any real man." The sound of horses moving away echoed through the Montana wilderness until it disappeared completely, leaving James and Elena alone in the clearing. The silence that followed was different from the threatening silence of a few minutes before. It was a silence full of relief, of things unsaid that could finally be expressed, of a connection that had been tested by danger and emerged stronger. Elena turned to James, and he saw tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of deep gratitude, of relief at no longer being alone in the fight, of something deeper she could not put into words. "You risked everything for me," she said, and her voice was choked with emotion. "You barely know me, and yet you stood by my side against dangerous men." James extended his hand and touched her face softly, feeling the warm skin and slightly salty from tears under his fingers. "I know enough," he said with absolute tenderness. "I know enough to know you are exactly the kind of woman worth fighting for. A brave woman who dedicates her life to protecting those who cannot protect themselves." They approached slowly, and when they finally kissed, it was with the intensity of 2 people who had found something precious they did not know they were looking for. When they separated, Elena looked deeply into his eyes and repeated the words that had started everything. "Now you are my man, James from Clear Creek Ranch." And this time James smiled and responded, "And you are my woman, Elena, protector of the Montana wilderness, forever." If you enjoyed seeing how courage and protection can create unbreakable bonds, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone standing up for what is right, even when it was dangerous? Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it today. And click on the video on your screen to watch another unforgettable story where love and bravery meet in the heart of the wilderness. The days that followed that confrontation in the Montana wilderness brought changes that neither James nor Elena could have anticipated. Changes that went far beyond the simple fact that William and his men had retreated, beyond the immediate danger that had been averted. These were changes that touched something much deeper, something that had to do with how 2 people who had lived their entire lives in isolation began to understand what it meant to no longer be alone. James returned to his ranch that evening with his mind spinning in circles that would not stop. He sat on the porch of his grandfather's house, the same porch where he had spent countless nights looking at the stars and wondering if this was all his life would ever be. The ranch, the cattle, the endless routine of a man working land that had been in his family for 3 generations. But now, when he looked toward the wilderness, he saw something different. He saw the small glow of Elena's fire in the distance, a light that represented a life lived on the margins of everything he had known, a woman who had chosen to fight a war that most people would never even know existed. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every time James closed his eyes, he saw the way Elena had looked at him when he stood between her and William's machete. He saw the tears in her eyes when she realized she was no longer fighting alone. He felt the warmth of her lips against his, a kiss that had tasted like promise and possibility, and something wild that he could not quite name. His grandfather had known about her. That fact kept circling back, demanding to be examined from every angle. His grandfather, a man who had taught James everything about the land, about survival, about responsibility, had kept Elena's existence a secret for years. Why? What had he understood about her situation that made him choose silence over revelation? James rose before dawn and found himself saddling his horse without consciously making the decision to do so. His body knew where he needed to go, even if his mind had not quite caught up. The ride to Elena's clearing felt different in the early morning light. The wilderness that had always seemed vaguely threatening now felt like it was revealing secrets, showing him pathways he had never noticed before, opening itself up in ways that suggested he had been blind to his own land for his entire life. When he arrived at the clearing, Eleanor was already awake. She was tending to her small garden of medicinal herbs, her movements efficient and practiced in the way of someone who had done this task thousands of times. One of the mountain lions, a large female with a distinctive scar across her shoulder, lay nearby, watching her work with an expression that James could only describe as protective. The scene was so peaceful, so natural, that James felt something shift inside his chest. This was not a crazy woman living in isolation. This was someone who had built a life, who had found purpose and meaning in circumstances that would have destroyed most people. Elena looked up when she heard his horse, and the smile that spread across her face made James's heart do something complicated and unexpected. "I did not think you would come back," she said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her hands. There was vulnerability in her voice, a hint of the girl who had learned too young that people leave, that safety is temporary, that trust is something that can be shattered in an instant. "I told you that you are my woman," James replied, dismounting and walking toward her. "Did you think those were just words?" He saw the way her eyes widened slightly, the way her breath caught. She had thought exactly that. She had thought that once the danger passed, once the adrenaline faded, he would realize what he had gotten himself into and disappear back to his normal life. James reached out and took her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work, the slight tremor that spoke of hope she was afraid to acknowledge. "I want to understand," he said quietly. "I want to understand your life, your connection to this place, to these animals. I want to understand why my grandfather kept your secret and what he saw that made him respect your isolation." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were different. These were tears of something breaking open, of walls that had been built over 20 years beginning to crack. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He found me about a year after my mother died. I was 15 and half wild, living like an animal because I did not know any other way to survive. He could have reported me to the authorities, could have had me taken away to some institution. Instead, he brought me supplies. Food, clothes, tools. He never asked for anything in return. He never told anyone I was here. He just helped me survive." The revelation hit James with unexpected force. His grandfather, in his quiet way, had been protecting Elena all these years, had seen a traumatized girl who needed safety more than she needed intervention, who needed space to heal in her own way on her own timeline. He never said anything, James murmured, more to himself than to Elena. Not one word in all the years I knew him. He made me promise something, Elena continued, sitting down on a log near her fire pit and pulling James down beside her. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, if I ever needed help, I would go to you. He said you were like him, that you had the same heart, the same understanding of what it means to protect rather than control. She looked at James with an intensity that made him feel exposed. He was right. They sat together as the sun rose higher, and Elena began to tell James her story, not the abbreviated version she had shared during the confrontation, but the full truth of what her life had been. She told him about her mother, a woman who had tried so hard to escape an abusive relationship, but who had never quite managed to get far enough away. She told him about the night they fled, how her mother had packed everything they could carry into a single bag and walked for miles through the wilderness to reach this hidden clearing. She told him about the brief period of peace they had found here, 3 months where they had started to believe they might actually be safe. And then she told him about the day her mother's ex-partner found them, how he had dragged her mother away while Elena hid in the trees, too terrified to move, too young to understand that hiding meant she would never see her mother alive again. She told him about the funeral, about being taken to a foster home in town, about the suffocating feeling of walls and rules, and people who meant well but who could not understand what she had lost. She told him about running away, about finding her way back to the clearing, about the decision to simply disappear into the wilderness and never come back. The mountain lions found me that first winter, Elena said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I was starving and sick, huddled in the cabin trying to figure out if I even wanted to keep living. They could have killed me easily. Instead, the female, the one you saw this morning, she brought me food. A rabbit already dead, left right outside my door. I thought I was hallucinating, but she kept coming back, kept bringing food, kept checking on me. Eventually, I realized she had lost her cubs that year. We were both grieving. We understood each other in a way that went beyond words. James listened without interrupting, his hand still holding Eleanor's, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. He was beginning to understand the depth of what she had survived, the strength it had taken not just to live, but to build a life worth living. The woman beside him was not broken, despite everything that had tried to break her. She was whole in a way that most people never achieved, forged by suffering into something both fierce and tender. And the hunting, James said finally. When did you realize what William and his men were doing? Elena's expression hardened. About 5 years ago. I started finding traps in areas where the mountain lions hunted. At first, I did not understand what they were for. Then I found one with a mountain lion caught in it, suffering, slowly dying. I managed to free her, but she was so injured she did not survive the night. I stayed with her until she died, and something inside me just broke. Or maybe it woke up. I decided right then that I would not let it happen again, that I would protect these animals the way they had protected me. So you started sabotaging their operation, James said, and there was admiration in his voice. I learned their patterns, Elena continued, and now there was a hint of satisfaction in her tone. I learned where they set their traps, when they came through, how they moved. I would destroy their equipment, scatter their bait, make noise to scare the animals away when I knew the hunters were close. They figured out someone was interfering, but they could not figure out who or how to stop it. It made them angry, very angry. James thought about the cruelty he had seen in William's face, the casual violence in the way he and his men had approached Elena. They were going to hurt you, he said flatly. If I had not been there, they were going to do more than just threaten. Eleanor nodded slowly. I know. I have known for a while that it was getting more dangerous. They have been getting more aggressive, more determined, but I could not stop. These mountain lions saved my life. I owe them everything. How could I just stand by and let them be killed? The answer revealed everything James needed to know about Elena's character. She was someone who paid her debts, who honored her connections, who would risk her own safety rather than abandon those who depended on her. It was a kind of loyalty that James recognized because he felt it too. That sense of responsibility to the land and the animals and the legacy that had been passed down to him. "You do not have to fight alone anymore," James said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. This was not just words spoken in the heat of the moment. This was a commitment, a choice to tie his life to hers in ways that went far beyond a simple attraction. Elena turned to look at him fully, and James saw hope and fear warring in her expression. "You do not understand what you are saying," she whispered. "If you stand with me, if you help me protect the mountain lions, William and his men will come after you too. They will try to destroy your reputation, damage your ranch, hurt your business. You could lose everything your grandfather built. Or," James said, moving closer to her, "we could actually stop them, together. You have been fighting this war with nothing but your bare hands and your courage, but I have resources, connections, legal standing. I can report them to the federal wildlife authorities. I can document their illegal activities. I can make enough noise that they cannot operate in the shadows anymore." He saw the moment when Elena began to believe him, when the possibility of actual victory started to seem real instead of impossible. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and then suddenly she was in his arms, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe, her face pressed against his chest as her whole body shook with the release of years of solitary struggle. James held her and let her cry, understanding that these tears were necessary, that they were washing away the accumulated weight of fighting alone for so long. He stroked her hair and murmured reassurances, and felt something settle inside himself, a sense of rightness that he had never experienced before. This was what he was meant to do. This was who he was meant to protect. When Elena finally pulled back, her eyes were red but clear. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." James smiled and touched her face, his fingers gentle against her tear-stained cheeks. "I know everything that matters," he said. "I know you are brave and loyal and willing to stand up for what is right, even when it costs you everything. I know you built a life in impossible circumstances and turned your pain into purpose. I know that when you look at me, I feel more alive than I have felt in years. That is enough. That is more than enough." They kissed again, and this time it was different from the desperate kiss they had shared after the confrontation. This was slower, deeper, a kiss that tasted like promise and commitment and the beginning of something that could last. When they separated, Elena was smiling, really smiling, in a way that transformed her entire face and made James realize just how beautiful she was when she was happy. "So what do we do now?" Elena asked, and her voice was steadier than James had ever heard it. "Now," James said, standing up and pulling her to her feet, "we start building our case against William and his operation. I am going to take photographs of your clearing, document the traps you have found, record everything you know about their movements and methods. Then I am going to contact the Federal Wildlife Service and lay it all out for them. Hunting mountain lions is a federal offense with serious penalties. If we can prove what William has been doing, he will not just lose his ability to hunt here, he will go to prison." Elena's eyes lit up with something that looked like fierce joy. "And in the meantime, James continued, you are going to move to the ranch. You are going to sleep in a real bed, eat regular meals, and stop living like you are preparing for a siege. You are going to let me take care of you the way my grandfather would have wanted me to." He saw the instinctive refusal forming on her lips and spoke before she could voice it. "I am not asking you to give up your independence or stop being who you are. I am asking you to accept help, to accept partnership, to let someone else carry part of the weight for a while. Can you do that?" Elena hesitated, and James could see the internal struggle playing out across her face. She had been alone for so long that accepting help felt like weakness, like giving up control, like opening herself up to potential abandonment. But he also saw the moment when she made the choice to trust him, when she decided to take the risk of letting someone in. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, I will try." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity that left James exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. He divided his time between running the ranch and building the case against William. He photographed everything Elena showed him: the destroyed traps, the areas where mountain lions had been killed, the evidence of illegal hunting that was scattered throughout the wilderness. He interviewed Elena extensively, recording her testimony about years of witnessing illegal activity. He compiled maps showing William's patterns and methods. And finally, he contacted a federal wildlife agent named Sarah Martinez, who agreed to come out and investigate. Agent Martinez arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, a serious woman in her 40s who listened to James's presentation with an intensity that suggested she took wildlife crimes very personally. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence spread across his kitchen table. "This is comprehensive," she said finally. "You have documented years of illegal activity with enough detail that we can build a solid case. I'm going to need to interview Elena directly, get her statement on record, and I'm going to need to conduct my own investigation of the areas you have identified. But based on what you have shown me, I think we can stop these men." James felt relief wash over him so powerfully that his knees went weak. "How long will it take?" "A few weeks to gather additional evidence and build the case," Agent Martinez replied. "Then we will make arrests. I should warn you that once we move forward with this, there could be retaliation. These men are not going to go quietly. You and Elena both need to be prepared for that." Elena, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the kitchen throughout the presentation, spoke up for the first time. "We are prepared," she said firmly. "We have been preparing for this for a long time." Agent Martinez smiled, and it was the first warm expression James had seen from her. "I believe you," she said. "Let me get your full statement, and then we will start the process of bringing these hunters to justice." The interview took hours. Elena recounted everything she had witnessed over the years, every trap, every kill, every threatening encounter. Agent Martinez recorded it all, asked detailed questions, pushed for specifics that would hold up in court. By the time they finished, Elena looked exhausted but also lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth to someone with the power to act on it had lifted a burden she had been carrying for too long. After Agent Martinez left, promising to be in touch soon with updates, James and Elena sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the wilderness. It had become their routine over the past weeks, these quiet evenings where they did not need to talk, but simply existed together in comfortable silence. "Do you think it will actually work?" Elena asked finally. "Do you think they will really arrest William?" "Yes," James said without hesitation. "Agent Martinez does not seem like someone who takes on a case unless she intends to win it, and the evidence is overwhelming. William and his men are going to face consequences for what they have done." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder, and James wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat that way as the stars began to appear, as the temperature dropped, and the sounds of the wilderness began their nightly symphony. James thought about how much had changed in such a short time, how a chance encounter with a woman surrounded by mountain lions had completely altered the trajectory of his life. "I never thought I would feel safe enough to sleep inside a house again," Elena murmured. "But I do. When I am with you, I do." James kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair that still carried hints of wild herbs and wood smoke, despite weeks of living at the ranch. "You will always be safe with me," he promised. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure of that." They did not go inside until long after full darkness had fallen, until the cold finally drove them to seek the warmth of the house. But even then, they lingered on the porch for a few extra moments, reluctant to let go of the peace they had found together under the vast Montana sky. The arrests happened 3 weeks later. Agent Martinez called early in the morning to inform them that federal agents had picked up William and his 2 associates at dawn. They had been charged with multiple counts of illegal hunting, wildlife trafficking, and conspiracy to commit violence. The evidence was so overwhelming that all three men were being held without bail pending trial. "It is over," Agent Martinez said, and James could hear the satisfaction in her voice. "They will not be hunting in Montana or anywhere else for a very long time. You and Elena can rest easy now." When James hung up the phone and turned to tell Elena the news, he found her standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face. But these were tears of relief, of justice finally served, of a war that had finally been won. "It is really over?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It is really over," James confirmed, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. "The mountain lions are safe. You are safe. We can stop looking over our shoulders now." Elena clung to him and cried, releasing years of fear and vigilance and constant danger. James held her through it all, stroking her back and murmuring reassurances, and feeling his own eyes sting with tears at the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. When Elena finally pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "We did it," she said wonderingly. "We actually did it." "You did it," James corrected gently. "You fought for those animals for years when no one else would. You never gave up, never stopped believing it mattered. I just helped you finish what you started." Elena shook her head firmly. "No, we did it together. You gave me something I never thought I could have, a partner, someone who believed in what I was fighting for enough to fight beside me. That changed everything." They spent the rest of that day celebrating in quiet ways. James took Elena on a ride through the wilderness, showing her parts of the ranch she had never seen, pointing out the places where his grandfather had taught him about the land. They visited Elena's clearing, which already looked different now that the threat of William had been removed, as if the land itself was breathing easier. They watched the mountain lions move through their territory with a new confidence, unaware that the danger that had stalked them had been eliminated, but sensing somehow that something fundamental had shifted. As evening approached and they rode back to the ranch, James found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. He had always assumed he would run the ranch alone, that his life would be defined by solitary responsibility and the slow passage of seasons. But now, with Elena beside him, he could imagine something different. He could imagine building a life that honored both her need for wildness and his need for stability. He could imagine children eventually, kids who would grow up understanding that courage sometimes means standing up for those who cannot protect themselves. That night, as they lay in bed with Elena curled against his side, James spoke the thought that had been forming in his mind all day. "Marry me," he said simply. Elena went very still, then lifted her head to look at him in the darkness. "What?" "Marry me," James repeated, reaching up to touch her face. "I know it has not been long. I know we are still figuring out how to build a life together, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my days with you. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are beside me. I want to face whatever comes next together. So marry me, Elena. Choose to be my partner in every sense of the word." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, and James was beginning to recognize the different kinds of tears she cried. These were tears of overwhelming emotion, of joy mixed with disbelief, of a happiness she had never imagined she would experience. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They kissed, and it felt like a seal on a promise that transcended words, a commitment that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. When they finally fell asleep, it was tangled together in a way that suggested neither one of them ever wanted to let go. The wedding was simple, held at the ranch with Agent Martinez serving as a witness, along with a few of James's closest neighbors. Elena wore a dress that James had bought for her in town, the first new clothes she had owned in years. She looked beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with the joy radiating from her face. As they exchanged vows on the porch, where they had spent so many evenings together, James looked into Elena's eyes and saw his entire future reflected there. a future of partnership and protection, of wildness and stability, of love that had been forged in danger and tested by time. When the simple ceremony concluded, and he kissed his wife for the first time, he felt something settle into place inside his chest, a sense of completeness he had not known he was missing. Elena smiled against his lips and whispered the words that had started everything, "My man." And James smiled back and responded, "My woman, forever." They built a life together that honored both their natures. Elena continued to spend time in the wilderness, monitoring the mountain lion population and working with Agent Martinez on wildlife protection initiatives. James ran the ranch, expanding slowly and carefully in ways that respected the land and the animals that called it home. Together, they became known throughout the region as protectors of the wilderness, people who understood that true strength meant defending those who could not defend themselves. Years later, when their children asked them how they met, James and Elena would smile at each other and tell the story of 3 mountain lions, a woman who refused to stop fighting, and a man who learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand beside someone who needs you. They told their children that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That love is not always comfortable, but it is always worth fighting for. And that protection is not control, but the willingness to put someone else's safety ahead of your own. And on quiet evenings, they still sat together on the porch, watching the wilderness they had worked so hard to protect, knowing that their story had become part of the land itself, a testament to what could be accomplished when 2 people chose to face the world together rather than alone. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that courage and love can change everything, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and become part of a community that believes in standing up for what is right. Share with us in the comments your own stories of protection and partnership, moments when someone stood beside you or when you chose to stand beside someone else. Your experiences matter. Your voice matters, and together we can create a space where these stories of bravery and connection continue to inspire. Click subscribe now, and let us continue this journey together, discovering the extraordinary power of choosing to protect and love with everything we have.